On January 6, 2016, viewers in the United Kingdom watched a flashback episode of a children's cartoon and noticed something missing. A 3-second shot of two women dancing too closely had been replaced with a reaction shot of the man standing across the room. The American version, which had aired on Cartoon Network 7 months earlier, was unedited. The same characters had touched, looked at each other, leaned in. In the British broadcast, none of it survived. The network released a statement explaining that the edit made the episode, in their words, more comfortable for local kids and their parents. That single cut was the smallest piece of what would become a global pattern. Across the next 3 years, this one animated series would be edited, dubbed, gender swapped, pulled from schedules, and finally banned outright on 3 continents. The reason was the same every time. That show was Steven Universe. The episode was called We Need to Talk, the 9th episode of the 2nd season. The scene that vanished lasted about 3 seconds, between 2 characters named Pearl and Rose Quartz. There are exactly 10 of these stories worth telling, and they will be told here in order, oldest first. Some involve scenes cut from specific episodes, some involve episodes that were not allowed to air at all. Some involve countries where the show simply vanished from the schedule with no public explanation. And one involves a country that banned not only Steven Universe, but 5 other animated children's series on the same day in a single statement. Before going further, a quick note: if you find long-form sleep essays like this, one, useful, subscribing genuinely helps the channel keep going. It costs nothing and takes about 3 seconds. Now, back to it. The earliest of the 10 happened on March 12, 2015, in France. It was technically not a ban, and it was technically not a removed scene. It was a translation. The episode in question was called Jailbreak, the 49th episode of the first season and the planned season finale, which had been moved up to air during a week-long event Cartoon Network was calling Steven Bomb. Jailbreak revealed something that the series had been building towards since its first episode. The character Garnet, who had been presented for 48 episodes as a single individual, was revealed to be a fusion, a merging of 2 smaller characters named Ruby and Sapphire. The reveal happened in a song that the show's creator Rebecca Sugar had written and that the singer Estelle had performed. The song was called Stronger Than You. The song is not just a victory anthem from Garnet to her homeworld antagonist Jasper. It is a declaration of what Garnet is. The lyrics throughout describe the relationship between the 2 characters whose love for one another forms her existence. The song references Ruby's anger and Sapphire's patience as Garnet's 2 components. It frames the relationship between them in language that any adult viewer would recognize as romantic. The English version aired in the United States on Cartoon Network on March 12, 2015, with no changes and no controversy, and was immediately recognized by viewers and animation critics as a significant moment in children's television history. When Jailbreak aired in France not long after, the French dub of Stronger Than You was different. The translation team had rendered the lyrics in a way that softened the romantic dimension of the song. Specific lines about the bond between Ruby and Sapphire had been retranslated so that the relationship being described read more like a deep friendship rather than a partnership. The structural meaning was still there. The emotional weight had been quietly dialed down. French fans of the show noticed almost immediately. The reaction was swift, and it was angry. Within days, viewers across France had begun posting side-by-side comparisons of the English original and the French version, with translations of both that made the difference visible to anyone willing to look. Cartoon Network France's response in this specific case was unusual and worth pausing on. They redubbed the song. The new French version restored the original romantic meaning, and the network framed the original translation as a translator's error rather than a deliberate edit. Whether the first choice was a genuine mistake or a deliberate softening is something that has been debated by French fans of the show ever since. What is not debatable is that this is the only time in the entire international censorship history of Steven Universe that an edit would be reversed. Every cut, every translation change, every removed scene that came after this, one would remain in place permanently. France was the first country to alter the show's content for international broadcast. France was also the last country, in any meaningful sense, to undo what it had done. Jailbreak contains other moments that the international edits would target repeatedly across the years that followed. After Garnet has defeated Jasper and the immediate threat is gone, Ruby and Sapphire briefly appear as their separate selves on the deck of the homeworld ship. They share a quiet reunion. In the American version, the 2 characters embrace and one kisses the other on the cheek. In the United Kingdom broadcast and several international broadcasts that followed, that kiss would be replaced with a repeat of an earlier moment from the same scene, looped to fill the second of removed footage. The first time it happened was in the UK shortly after the episode entered international rotation. The same edit was then carried into Latin America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. By the time the show had been on the air for 2 more years, the same scene had been edited in at least 6 different national broadcasts. What aired in the United States as a complete reunion had become, in those countries, a near reunion with a missing second. The same episode also contains another moment that the international edits would target. During the climactic fight between Garnet and Jasper, Garnet smashes the helmet that Jasper has been wearing throughout the season. The destruction is shown as a quick visual impact, and the song Stronger Than You continues underneath without interruption. In multiple international broadcasts of Jailbreak, that single moment was replaced with a brief field of stars. The visual was edited, but the audio was left intact, which meant the song now continued over an unrelated visual cut. International viewers who watched the song closely could hear the missing second in the audio. Fans who could not identify what had been removed could still feel that something had been. The pattern that would define the next 3 years of the show's international history was already visible in this single episode. Visual content was being trimmed, the audio underneath was being left alone, the seams were showing, and once viewers learned how to look for them, they would find them in nearly every episode that followed. The French dub controversy faded relatively quickly. The Jailbreak edit was small enough that it did not draw lasting international attention. What it did do, in retrospect, was establish the template. The country had taken something out, and there had been a backlash, and the country had put it back. That was the only time the sequence would play out in that order. Every subsequent edit in every subsequent country would follow a different arc. The country would take something out. There would be a backlash. The country would not put it back. The cuts would accumulate. The show would keep airing. The next episode would air, and a different country would edit a different scene. And the cycle would continue. By the end of 2015, Steven Universe was being internationally edited in a way that no other Cartoon Network series of its era was being internationally edited. By the end of 2016, it was being banned outright. The pattern that began with one translated song in March 2015 became over time the most documented case of international animation censorship in the streaming era. None of it would have been possible without the way that song had been received in the first place. The second of the 10 happened 9 months later, in June 2015, in the United States, and again in early January 2016 in the United Kingdom. The episode was We Need to Talk, the 9th episode of the second season, originally aired on Cartoon Network on June 18, 2015. It is the moment from the cold open of this video. It is also the moment that turned international Steven Universe censorship from a niche topic discussed by a small subset of fans into a story that animation industry trade publications and mainstream entertainment journalists were covering across multiple continents. We Need to Talk is a flashback episode. The frame story has Steven and his friend Connie helping his father Greg organize old records in the back of Greg's van. While listening to a record, the two children accidentally fuse into their shared form, Stevani. Greg, who has never seen Steven fuse before, watches this happen and is rattled by it. To explain what fusion means to him, Greg tells the two of them the story of the first time he ever saw Rose Quartz, Steven's mother, fuse. The flashback that follows takes up the bulk of the episode. It depicts Greg as a young man recording a song called What Can I Do, with Rose and Pearl present. Pearl, who is at this point in the show's chronology in love with Rose, decides to demonstrate fusion to Greg as a way of asserting that humans cannot do what gems can do. She and Rose fuse on screen in front of Greg in what is depicted as an intimate dance. The fusion is brief. Greg, watching, registers something between confusion and hurt. The flashback continues from there. In the original American broadcast, the dance between Pearl and Rose plays out as it was animated and storyboarded. There is a close-up moment between the two characters during the fusion. They lean into each other. There is a held look, the dance is over in a few seconds, and the episode moves on. In the broadcast that aired on Cartoon Network UK in early January 2016, the same scene was structured differently. The fusion still happened, the dance was still implied. But the 3-second close-up of the two women dancing too closely together was no longer present. In its place was a reaction shot of Greg's face, held for the duration of the cut. A fan in the United Kingdom posted the two versions side by side on Tumblr on the first weekend of January 2016. The post identified the specific cut, frame by frame, and asked a question that thousands of viewers would shortly be asking. Why had this specific scene been altered when, throughout the same episode and throughout other episodes of the show that had aired uncut in the United Kingdom, romantic or physically intimate moments between opposite-sex characters had been left in. The fusion dance between Pearl and Rose was edited out. The romantic dance between Greg and Rose that happens later in the same episode was not. The shorter, less explicit interaction between two female characters had been removed. The longer, more explicit interaction between a male character and a female character had been retained. The Tumblr post traveled. By Sunday, January 10th, 2016, a Change.org petition had been started asking Cartoon Network UK to restore the cut footage. Within 24 hours, it had over 3,000 signatures. Within a week, it had over 6,000. Within 2 weeks, it had over 9,000. Petitions of that size do not generate corporate responses by default. The petition that targeted We Need to Talk did. Cartoon Network in Europe released a statement to the LGBT-focused outlet Pink News and several mainstream trade publications, including the Mary Sue, the AV Club, and Animation Magazine. The statement acknowledged the edit. It did not apologize for the edit. It explained that in the United Kingdom, the network had to ensure that everything on air was suitable for children of any age at any time, and that the slightly edited version of the episode felt more comfortable for local kids and their parents. The statement immediately became the part of the story. The US broadcast had been rated PG, which is to say parental guidance, which is to say a rating that explicitly allows for content that families may want to discuss with their children. The UK does not use the same rating system, which is part of what Cartoon Network was arguing in its defense. But the UK system that applied to children's broadcasts allows for romantic content as long as that content is not explicit or overt. The dance between Pearl and Rose was not explicit and not overt. By the network's own admitted standards, the scene fell within what was permissible. The decision to edit it had been made anyway. The wording of the statement, particularly the phrase about being more comfortable for local kids and their parents, was widely interpreted by viewers as a euphemism. The discomfort being referenced was not the kind of discomfort children might feel watching the scene. It was the kind of discomfort the network anticipated some parents might feel watching their children watch the scene. The phrase comfortable for local kids and their parents was reprinted in dozens of articles in the following weeks. It became, in a particular subset of animation discourse, a shorthand for a specific kind of soft censorship. The word comfortable was being used to do something specific. The slightly edited version was being framed as a service to families rather than as a service to the network's own anticipation of complaints. The choice to leave heterosexual romantic content in place in the same episode on the same network made the framing harder to defend. By the time the trade publication The Mary Sue published its full coverage of the censorship on January 6, 2016, the petition was already moving. By the time the AV Club, Animation Magazine, and the comic news outlet Bleeding Cool had run their own coverage in the days that followed, the story had moved beyond the show's existing fan base. People who had never watched Steven Universe in their lives were reading about an edit to a children's cartoon in the United Kingdom, because the framing of the edit had become a small case study in how networks talk about LGBT content and family. Programming. There was a second factor that amplified the response, which has often been forgotten in retrospect. The We Need to Talk edit was discovered at the exact moment that the next episode of Steven Universe was about to air. On the morning of January 4th, 2016, 2 days before the Mary Sue petition story published, Cartoon Network in the United States aired an episode called The Answer. The Answer was the 22nd episode of the second season, and the episode was structured as a fairy tale told by Garnet to Steven on the night of his birthday. The story Garnet tells is the story of how Ruby and Sapphire first met, first fused, and first decided to stay together as the fusion that became Garnet. The episode is, in plain terms, a love story. There is no other framing for it. Within hours of The Answer airing in the United States, fans in the United Kingdom were asking the question that the petition organizers had been preparing for. If a 3-second dance between Pearl and Rose had been edited from We Need to Talk by Cartoon Network UK, what was going to happen when The Answer aired in the United Kingdom? The episode is 11 minutes long. The romantic content between Ruby and Sapphire fills almost the entire 11 minutes. The structure of the episode does not permit reaction shot edits in the way that the brief Pearl-Rose dance had permitted them. There is no Greg standing nearby to cut to. There is no third party watching. The episode is just the two of them, and the story of them, and the song they sing together while they figure out what they are to each other. The question that the petition's organizers raised was direct. How would the United Kingdom broadcast handle an episode where the romantic content was not a 3-second moment, but the entire body of the episode? The United Kingdom would, eventually, air The Answer mostly intact. The cuts that were made to The Answer in some other markets would not be present in the British broadcast, but the question itself was the thing that mattered. Until We Need to Talk had been edited, The assumption among most viewers in most countries was that Steven Universe was being broadcast roughly as written, with localized translations being the only meaningful difference between markets. The We Need to Talk edit broke that assumption. After that edit, every subsequent episode in every subsequent country was being watched not just by fans of the show, but by fans of the show with the specific knowledge that an edit could be made at any time, in any market, without notice. And that the framing offered by the network would be that the edit had been made for the comfort of local kids and their parents. The Cartoon Network UK statement also contained a smaller phrase that has been less widely quoted, but is worth pausing on. The statement said that Cartoon Network in Europe often shows amended versions of programs from US originals. This was, in the strict sense, true. International broadcasts of American animated television had routinely been edited for decades, for reasons that range from runtime requirements to commercial structures to local content rating systems. The We Need to Talk edit was not the first edit to any cartoon ever made by Cartoon Network UK, and the network knew that fans knew this. The framing they were offering was not that this edit was unusual. The framing was that this edit was normal, that all international cartoons get edited, and that the only thing unusual about this one was that someone had noticed. What that framing did not address was that the people who had noticed were not mostly complaining about edits in the abstract. They were complaining about a specific pattern. Throughout the previous 9 months, since the French dub of Stronger Than You had been quietly corrected and then largely forgotten, viewers in multiple countries had been quietly noting that the international edits to Steven Universe were not random. They were targeted in a specific direction. The edits removed or softened scenes that depicted intimacy between female characters. They did not, with any notable consistency, remove or soften scenes that depicted intimacy between opposite-sex characters. The We Need to Talk edit was simply the cleanest possible example of the pattern. A single 3-second moment, easily identifiable with a side-by-side comparison that could be viewed in 2 browser tabs. The petition that grew around that single edit grew so quickly because the edit confirmed something that viewers in the United Kingdom and elsewhere had already started to suspect. Cartoon Network UK never reversed the edit. The British broadcast of We Need to Talk continued to air with the Pearl Rose dance replaced by the Greg reaction shot. The same edit was carried over into the European edit master that Turner and Mia used for broadcasts across Ireland, Malta, Scandinavia, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and parts of Eastern Europe. As of the most recent documentation by the Steven Universe Wiki's censorship project, the same edit is still present in the UK version of the episode, as it streams on certain regional video-on-demand services. The original American version of the scene plays on the US broadcast and on most North American streaming services. The European version, with the substituted reaction shot, plays in the markets that Turner and Mia controlled at the time. The 2 versions have coexisted for nearly a decade. They will likely continue to coexist for as long as the episode is in distribution. The single petition that gathered 9,000 signatures in January 2016 changed nothing in the broadcast itself. What it did change was the visibility of the pattern. After January 2016, every subsequent international edit to Steven Universe would be documented immediately, often within days of broadcast, by a small network of fans across multiple countries who had started keeping records. If you go looking for those records now, you will find them. They are still being kept. The third of the 10 happened almost exactly when the petition over We Need to Talk was peaking. The episode is called The Answer, the 22nd episode of the 2nd season, originally aired on Cartoon Network in the United States on January 4th, 2016. It is the episode that, more than any other in the series at that point, was structurally a love story. And it is the first episode of Steven Universe that was banned outright. Not edited, not softened, not translated around, removed from the broadcast schedule in 2 countries, Russia and Bulgaria, and never aired in either. To understand why The Answer became the first outright ban, you need to understand what the episode is. The frame is simple. Garnet wakes Steven on the night of his birthday and tells him a story. The story is a fairy tale about how Ruby and Sapphire first met. The visual style of the flashback shifts into something more painterly and stylized than the show's normal animation. The flashback takes up most of the 11-minute runtime. It begins on the planet Homeworld, in a setting that the show would later identify as a sky arena. Sapphire, a rare and aristocratic Homeworld gem with the ability to see the future, is being escorted by 3 Ruby soldiers, all visually identical to one another, except for the location of their gemstones. Sapphire is brought before Blue Diamond to report on what she has foreseen regarding the rebellion that will eventually become the show's central historical event. What Sapphire has foreseen is the destruction of 2 of the 3 rubies and her own death. She delivers this report calmly. The 2 rubies who will die accepted as their fate. The 3rd ruby, the one whose only line earlier had been a joke about being able to fuse with the others to become stronger, does not accept it. When Rose Quartz and Pearl attack the arena and prepare to defeat the rubies as Sapphire predicted, the 3rd ruby refuses to let Sapphire die. She lunges. She intercepts Pearl's sword. In the process of saving Sapphire, she unintentionally fuses with her. The fusion is what becomes Garnet. The story of Garnet is the story of 2 beings who chose, in a single instant, to remain together. The rest of the episode is the slow walk through what that choice meant. Sapphire, having seen every possible future, has just seen one she did not predict. Ruby, having intercepted a sword for someone she had known for less than an hour, has just discovered something she did not know existed. The 2 of them spend the rest of the episode wandering on Earth, separating and refusing, talking about what they had just been and what they wanted to become. You can see, even from that synopsis, why the episode would be impossible to edit for content. The romance is not a scene in the episode. The romance is the episode. There is no way to remove the dance between Ruby and Sapphire, the way there had been a way to remove the dance between Pearl and Rose in We Need to Talk. There is no reaction shot to cut to. There is no third party watching. There is only the 2 characters, alone in a forest, alone on a cliff, alone in a snowfield, slowly understanding each other. The only structural option, if the episode could not air, was to not air it. That is what happened in Russia. That is what happened in Bulgaria. The episode was not given a Russian language broadcast on Cartoon Network's Russian feed when the rest of the 2nd season aired in that territory. It was not given a Bulgarian language broadcast either. The episode was simply absent from the schedule. The episodes around it aired in sequence. The episode itself was skipped. Russian and Bulgarian viewers who were following the show could watch the episode that came before it and the episode that came after it, but the central episode in that broadcast block was not there. The skip was not announced. Cartoon Network did not release a public statement about why The Answer would not be airing in those territories. The episodes that came after it continued to air. Eventually, viewers in those countries who paid close attention to American broadcast information realized that they had been watching the season minus 1 specific episode. Why those 2 countries and not others? The most direct explanation has to do with Russian law. In June 2013, the Russian Federation passed a federal law commonly described in English as the Gay Propaganda Law. The full title of the law is longer, but the operative section makes it illegal to distribute, through media intended for minors, information that promotes what the law calls non-traditional sexual relationships. The penalties for violating the law include fines for individuals, larger fines for officials, and substantially larger fines for legal entities, with the most severe penalties applied to foreign media corporations. The law has been in continuous force since 2013, and it has been used in the years since to remove or restrict access to a range of films, television programs, books, and online materials whose content was judged to fall within the law's restrictions. The Answer, with its central plot being the formation of a romantic relationship between 2 female-coded gem characters, was a clear-cut case under that law as Cartoon Network's Russian distributor evaluated it. Bulgaria, which is not subject to the Russian law, was at the time grouped with Russia and several other Eastern European countries under a single Turner EMEA regional broadcast feed. The feed used a single master edit that applied to all of the countries in the territory. If The Answer could not air in Russia, the simplest operational solution was for The Answer not to air on the Turner regional feed at all. Bulgaria lost the episode as a side effect of the Russian decision, not because of any Bulgarian legal restriction. The same explanation would later apply to several other Eastern European countries that, depending on the year and the specific feed, would also miss specific episodes of the show. The Answer is also worth noting for what happened to it in the markets where it did air. In the United Kingdom, the episode aired roughly as written, in part because the public attention on the We Need to Talk edit had made an outright cut of an entire 11-minute episode, politically more expensive than the network was willing to absorb. In the Middle East and North Africa, the episode was eventually removed from the Cartoon Network MENA broadcast and from the related Cartoon Network Arabic broadcast, although it did remain available on Netflix MENA for some period afterward. In the Philippines, the version of the episode that aired on the Turner Asia Pacific feed was a substantially shortened cut, with several scenes between Ruby and Sapphire trimmed for runtime. The Scandinavian broadcasts, which used the Turner EMEA master, kept the episode largely intact, but adjusted some of the dialogue translations in ways that softened the relationship language. The pattern across all of these markets was that the episode survived in some form almost everywhere except the two countries that simply refused to air it. The Answer received a Primetime Emmy nomination in the Outstanding Short Format Animation category in 2016. It did not win. The episode that beat it was a Robot Chicken Christmas special. The nomination was widely covered in animation trade press in the United States, and the Emmy ceremony itself was watched by a global audience. The juxtaposition of the episode receiving an industry honor in the United States while being banned from broadcast in 2 foreign countries was noted at the time by several writers covering the show. The story Garnet tells Steven in the episode is, in its closing minutes, framed as an answer to the question that gives the episode its title. The question is implied rather than stated. The answer is that Garnet exists because 2 other gems chose to remain together. The question is what was holding them. The answer is given in the form of the song the 2 of them sing toward the end of the flashback, a song the show would later return to multiple times across multiple seasons. You can hear the same musical phrase quoted in the song Stronger Than You that closes the season finale. You can hear it again in the wedding episode that would air 2 years later. The episode that Russia and Bulgaria did not show was the foundational episode that the rest of the show would build on. Viewers in those countries watched what came after without ever having seen what it was built on. A children's book adaptation of The Answer was published in October 2016 by Cartoon Network Books and Penguin Random House, written by Rebecca Sugar and illustrated by Elle McKelka and Tiffany Ford. The book is a faithful adaptation of the episode with original watercolor-style artwork that expands on the painterly aesthetic of the broadcast version. It became a New York Times bestseller. As of the most recent retail data, the book remains in print, has been translated into several languages, and has been used as a recommended title in school library reading lists in multiple countries, including, notably, in markets where the original animated episode did not air. The book has been sold in Russia in the original English language edition through international booksellers, and Russian language pirate editions have circulated online for years. A Russian fan of the show who could not legally watch the broadcast version of the episode could, with some effort, obtain the same story in print form. The episode itself remained off the Russian Cartoon Network feed. For Bulgarian viewers, the situation was different in one specific way. Bulgaria does not have an equivalent to the Russian propaganda law. Bulgarian viewers who realized that the episode had been skipped on their Cartoon Network feed had no domestic legal basis on which the skip was justified. The episode was missing because of an upstream regional broadcast decision made by Turner MEA to apply the same content master to multiple territories. The Bulgarian government did not request the skip. The Bulgarian Content Rating Board did not require the skip. The skip happened because the feed that served Bulgaria also served Russia, and the version of the feed that satisfied Russian regulators was the version that aired across the entire territory. This is, in the years that followed, a pattern that would repeat. International broadcast regions tend to use shared content masters across many countries. The most restrictive country in a given region tends to set the master. The other countries in that region inherit the master whether or not they would have chosen the same restriction on their own. A viewer in Sofia who wanted to watch The Answer in 2016 had no domestic legal reason to be denied the episode. The reason they were denied it was 178 miles to the east, in Moscow. By the time the second season of Steven Universe finished its broadcast run in early 2016, this was the first of what would become a confirmed pattern. An episode that the show's creators wrote, that the show's production crew animated, that Cartoon Network in the United States aired in prime time on its standard children's programming block, and that received critical acclaim and an Emmy nomination, did not exist in the broadcast version of the show that aired in at least 2 countries. There was no version of that episode that those viewers could legally access through the channel they were watching the rest of the show on. The episode existed, it was being aired, it was being honored, it just was not being shown to them. The 4th of the 10 happened 5 months later, in June 2016. The episode is Hit the Diamond, the 5th episode of the 3rd season, originally aired on Cartoon Network on June 2nd, 2016. It is the episode that the show's writers and animators have, in subsequent interviews, often cited as one of their personal favorites to work on. It is also the 2nd episode in the series to be banned outright in Russia and Bulgaria, and the first to draw a public response from a foreign government's official cultural commentary apparatus over what was happening to its translation. The premise of Hit the Diamond is, on the surface, the most disarming setup the show would ever use. A group of homeworld gems called rubies, led by a single character known throughout most of the episode as Doc, arrive on Earth searching for Jasper, who had been pulled to the bottom of the ocean 2 seasons earlier. The rubies are looking for the missing Jasper because she had been assigned to escort a homeworld official, and they need her to confirm a status report. The crystal gems hiding in a barn with Peridot, who has by this point in the series defected to Earth, need to keep the rubies from finding Peridot. The solution that the episode arrives at, through a series of fumbled interactions, is for both teams to play a game of baseball. The winner of the game gets the planet, the losers leave Earth. The rest of the episode is the baseball game. What you would not initially guess from that synopsis is that the episode is also, structurally, a romantic comedy. Garnet, the leader of the Crystal Gems, unfuses for the duration of the game so that Ruby and Sapphire can play separately. Ruby is on the Crystal Gems team. Sapphire is positioned on the opposing side as a member of the Crystal Gems team's bench. The 5 homeworld Rubies on the opposing side do not know that the Ruby playing for the Crystal Gems is the same Ruby who, by the end of the episode, will refuse with Sapphire to become Garnet again. Throughout the baseball game, Ruby and Sapphire flirt openly. They make eyes at each other from across the field. They whisper things to each other when they pass. Sapphire makes baseball puns about her own movement. Ruby responds by making baseball puns about Sapphire's. The rest of the Crystal Gems, who all know what is happening, try to keep the Rubies from noticing. Steven, who is meant to be the umpire, has to repeatedly redirect the two of them back to the game. The Rubies, who are not exactly experienced at picking up on subtext, take a long time to notice anything at all. The American broadcast of Hit the Diamond presented all of this as written. The flirting was unambiguous. The dialogue between Ruby and Sapphire was unambiguous. The eventual moment near the end, where Ruby and Sapphire refuse openly in front of the homeworld Rubies as a kind of triumphant reveal, was unambiguous. In the Russian and Bulgarian broadcasts, the episode did not air. The same regional broadcast decision that had kept the answer off those feeds applied to Hit the Diamond as well. Russian viewers who had followed the 3rd season of Steven Universe by that point were watching their second outright skip in the show's run. The episode that aired in Russia the day Hit the Diamond would have aired was the next episode in the production sequence, and the Russian feed continued from there. In the Scandinavian markets, Hit the Diamond aired with a translation modification that became its own minor international story. The Swedish language dub of the episode altered specific lines of dialogue between Ruby and Sapphire to reduce the romantic content. In the original English version, Ruby and Sapphire engage in dialogue that includes specific words like flirting and lines that imply they are looking at each other in a particular way. In the Swedish version, the word flirting was replaced with the word chatting. The line where Ruby tells Sapphire she can look at her when something happens was replaced with a more generic line about Sapphire watching her play. The structural meaning was preserved. The romantic specificity was removed. The Swedish dub change was noticed almost immediately by Swedish viewers, and it was reported in Swedish media within weeks. The reporting was particularly pointed because the assumption among most international viewers had been that Scandinavian countries, which are generally treated as among the more LGBT-tolerant societies in Europe and have legal protections that exceed those in many other parts of the continent, would not need to soften the content of a children's cartoon for the same reasons that Russia had refused to air it. The Swedish edit was harder to justify on legal or cultural grounds. The reasoning offered by Cartoon Network's Scandinavian distributor was vague. The line was given that the Swedish language children's programming standards required a softer treatment of romantic content of any kind, and that the change was applied consistently to romantic content involving any combination of characters. Whether that consistency claim was accurate was disputed by Swedish viewers who could point to other Cartoon Network programs airing in the same time slot that contained romantic content between opposite-sex characters with no equivalent dub. Modifications. The Swedish language edit of Hit the Diamond eventually drew comments from a member of the Swedish Discrimination Ombudsman's office, who noted that while the office did not regulate fictional television content directly, the case raised questions about how Swedish language children's broadcasts were handling LGBT content in ways that diverged from the original English versions. Cartoon Network Scandinavia did not modify the dub. After this comment, the Swedish version of the episode continues to use the softened translation in the regions where it remains in circulation. Sweden, like the United Kingdom, joined the small group of countries where the international edits had been documented by viewers, raised in public statements, and not reversed by the network. The pattern by now was familiar. The country had taken something out. There had been a reaction. The country had not put it back. There was a smaller edit applied to Hit the Diamond in the Turner Asia Pacific Master. That is worth mentioning because of how it would echo through later episodes. In several Asian markets, including the Philippines, a brief moment during the baseball game where one of the homeworld Rubies makes physical contact with one of the Crystal Gems was edited out. The reason given was that the contact, which in the original is a clearly comedic moment of an aggressive Ruby pushing a less aggressive Crystal Gem out of the way, registered too closely to physical violence for the standards applied to that broadcast region. The edit, when you watch it now in side-by-side comparison, is brief and structurally minor. But it is also the first time that the Asian regional edits to Steven Universe began applying to non-romantic content. The previous edits had been about romance. This one was about a brief moment of contact. Once that line was crossed, the regional edits would begin to apply more broadly, and by the end of the show's run, the Asian region master version of multiple episodes was significantly shorter than the American version. Not just because of romance edits, but because of accumulated small cuts applied to anything that could be flagged as potentially inappropriate. Hit the Diamond is also notable for what was not edited in any market. The eventual moment near the end of the episode, when Ruby and Sapphire refuse into Garnet in front of the assembled rubies, is shot as a triumphant fusion sequence with no soft framing. There is no question in the visual language of the scene what is happening or why. The two characters love each other. They form Garnet because they love each other. The homeworld rubies, watching the fusion happen, react with a mixture of horror and confusion that the episode plays as comedy. The American version, the United Kingdom version, the Latin American version, the Scandinavian version, and the Middle East version that briefly aired before the show was removed from the MENA feed entirely, all preserved this final fusion. The countries that edited the episode's dialogue did not edit the fusion. The countries that softened the flirting did not soften the resolution. The episode could not be aired in the two markets where it was banned outright. The episode survived in some recognizable form, in every other market. The reasoning for why the fusion itself was preserved while the dialogue around it was edited has been the subject of a small, ongoing debate among fans who follow the international censorship history of the show. The most direct interpretation is that fusion, as a concept, is sufficiently abstract in the show's mythology that it can be read in multiple ways. Two characters becoming one larger character through dance could, on a generous reading, be framed as something other than a romantic act. The dialogue and the flirting that lead up to a fusion are more direct. They are unambiguous in a way that the fusion itself, taken as a single visual moment, perhaps is not. International edits that wanted to preserve the show's structural coherence while reducing what they viewed as the inappropriate content had a relatively narrow window to work in. They edited the dialogue, they edited the dance leading into the fusion. They generally did not edit the fusion itself. This pattern would hold across most of the third and fourth seasons. The edited Steven Universe being watched in the markets that received the EMEA and Asia Pacific Masters was not a Steven Universe with the fusion concept removed. It was a Steven Universe where the romantic context for the fusions had been steadily softened. A viewer in Bulgaria who had managed to find translations or unofficial versions of the episodes that had been skipped on their feed could see the fusions that the broadcast version had also shown. What they would also see, that the broadcast version had not shown, was the dialogue and the dancing that explained what those fusions were. The fusions in the international cuts became something like statements without context. They happened, they were powerful. They were celebrated within the show's plot. What they meant, in romantic terms, was the part that had been edited away. The viewing experience created by all of this by the time the show was halfway through its third season in 2016 was something genuinely strange. International viewers were watching a continuous animated story whose central characters included a fusion that was openly described in the source material as a romantic relationship made physical, while the version of the story they were being shown had quietly removed almost every direct statement of what that relationship was. The structure of the show remained intact. The romance under the structure had been thinned. Viewers who were aware of what was happening could fill in the missing context themselves. Viewers who were not aware could enjoy a slightly more abstract version of the same show. What no viewer in those markets could do, even if they wanted to, was watch the version of the show that the show's creators had actually made. That version aired in the United States. That version was sold on DVD in the United States. That version was, after some delay, made available through American streaming services. In the markets where the international cuts applied, the version that was available was the version that had been adjusted for what the local feed believed local audiences could handle. If you happened to live in one of those markets, you were watching a show that quietly disagreed with itself about what you were allowed to see. The fifth of the 10 happened in late July of 2016, 6 weeks after Hit the Diamond, and it involved an episode that was, in form, unlike anything the show had done before. Mr. Greg is the 8th episode of the 3rd season, originally aired on Cartoon Network on July 19, 2016. It is the first fully musical episode in the series. It contains 7 songs, more than any other Steven Universe episode at that point or for some time after, And it is the third episode in a row, at this point in the broadcast pattern, to be banned outright in Russia. The Russian feed had now skipped The Answer, Hit the Diamond, and Mr. Greg in that order. The pattern was no longer a possible coincidence. It was a deliberate editorial policy applied to specific episodes whose content the Russian distributor considered impossible to air under existing law. To understand what Russia was specifically banning when it banned Mr. Greg, you have to look at the structure of the episode. The premise is comparatively simple. Steven, his father Greg, and Pearl take a trip to Empire City, the show's stand-in for New York. The previous episode had ended with Greg receiving a payout of approximately $10 million from a previous music industry settlement. Greg, suddenly wealthy for the first time in his life, decides to take Steven and Pearl on vacation. They check into a hotel, they sing the title song, they tour the city. Greg, in the title song, performs as a kind of theatrical version of himself. With the hotel staff joining in as a chorus, the episode plays for its first act as something like an animated stage musical. What sets up the second act is the moment when Greg asks Pearl to dance during the song. Pearl, who has spent years processing her feelings about Rose Quartz, refuses. The refusal is sudden and breaks the rhythm of the song mid-verse. The hotel staff stops singing, the song stops. The mood of the episode shifts. Later that night, while Steven and Greg are asleep in the hotel room, Pearl alone sings a song that is not in the original musical theater style of the title song. The song she sings is called It's Over, Isn't It? It is a ballad. It is Pearl alone addressing the absent Rose Quartz and addressing her own awareness that she has lost the woman she loved to the man Rose chose to be with. It is the most direct statement the show had made to that point about the romantic dimension of Pearl's character. The song is, in its lyrics and its structure, a torch song. It belongs to a specific tradition of musical theater ballads in which a character alone on stage addresses someone who is no longer present. The traditional reference point most often cited by viewers is the kind of late second act number in a Broadway musical, where the protagonist sits at a piano or stands at a window and sings to the audience about what they have lost. Pearl sings about Rose. Pearl sings about Greg. Pearl sings about Steven, who is the living evidence that Rose chose someone other than her. The song ends with Pearl alone in the hotel room, the camera holding on her for an extra beat before the music fades. Greg and Steven, who have woken up during the song, have heard the entire thing. Greg leaves the room and goes to the hotel bar to drink alone. You cannot edit the song out of the episode. It is the structural center of the episode. The third act of Mr. Greg is the resolution of the tension that the song creates. Steven, having watched both his father and Pearl reach a point of mutual recognition that neither of them has been able to articulate, pushes them to talk. The talk eventually turns into another song, a song called Both of You, in which Steven, sitting at the hotel piano, gently presses them to admit what they have not been able to admit. Greg and Pearl eventually dance together at the end. The reconciliation is not romantic. It is something quieter than that. The two of them, who have spent years not knowing how to be in the same room, become able to be in the same room. They are bound by the same loss. The episode ends with Pearl and Greg driving Steven back to Beach City, conversing quietly while Steven, in the back of the van, falls asleep. The last image is of a star above the van as it crosses the city limits. The Russian distributor reviewed Mr. Greg and chose not to air it. The reasoning, in operational terms, was that the central song, It's Over, Isn't It?, made the romantic context of Pearl's relationship with Rose Quartz explicit in a way that was incompatible with the gay propaganda law. The song could not be edited around, the episode could not be aired without the song. The decision to skip the episode was, in this case, less ambiguous than the decision to skip The Answer or Hit the Diamond had been. Pearl is in this episode openly singing about her love for a female character. There is no third character to cut to. There is no flirtation that could be retranslated as friendship. The song is the song. The Bulgarian feed, which shared the EMEA Russian master, also skipped the episode. The two countries that had skipped The Answer and Hit the Diamond were now also skipping Mr. Greg. As with the previous skips, neither country issued a public statement about why the episode was being skipped. Viewers who were paying attention realized that the pattern was now firmly established. Episodes that the Russian distributor judged to be incompatible with their domestic content law would not air. Bulgaria would inherit the same decisions. The other countries in the EMEA region would, depending on their feed configuration, either receive the episodes through alternative routes or also miss them. The total list of countries where Mr. Greg did not air at all on its original broadcast cycle includes Russia, Bulgaria, and a rotating selection of smaller Eastern European territories that shared infrastructure with the Russian feed. The song It's Over, Isn't It? Became, in the months after Mr. Greg first aired, one of the most watched and most shared moments from the show. Independent uploads of the song, isolated from the episode and posted to video sharing platforms, accumulated millions of views within the first year. Cover versions by professional and amateur singers proliferated. The song was added to lists of significant animated musical numbers in trade publications. Estelle, the actor who voices Garnet, and Dee Dee Magno-Hall, the actor who voices Pearl, both gave multiple interviews about the song and its place in the show's emotional arc. Magno-Hall, in particular, became closely associated with the song. She has performed it live at multiple animation conventions in the years since. In the United States, the song became, for a particular subset of viewers, the moment they would point to as the moment they realized what kind of show Steven Universe was. In Russia, the song never aired on the network where the rest of the show was airing. There was a smaller pattern that emerged from Mr. Greg specifically. After this episode, the show's production team began to receive questions and interviews about whether the international censorship was affecting their writing decisions. Whether they were aware, while writing, that certain episodes would not air in certain countries. Whether that awareness was changing what they wrote. The answers from the show's creator, Rebecca Sugar, and from the writers and storyboard artists who worked on the relevant episodes were consistent. They knew. They were aware. They were not changing what they wrote. The episodes that were being banned were the episodes that the show was building toward. The romantic content was not in their framing an addition that could be removed without damaging the rest of the structure. It was the structure. The fact that some countries would not show some episodes was, for the creative team, a fact about the world rather than a fact about the show. They would continue to write the show they were writing. The international distribution would handle what the international distribution would handle. That position would, in retrospect, become one of the more frequently cited examples of a creative team choosing to maintain a specific kind of representation in a children's animated series under conditions where doing so created concrete commercial consequences. Cartoon Network executives, by Rebecca Sugar's later public account, were not enthusiastic about the trajectory that the show was on. There were internal discussions, in Sugar's account, about whether certain episodes should be written differently to make them easier to distribute internationally. Sugar's position in those discussions was that the show would be written as the show. The international cuts and bans would happen. The episodes would still exist as they were written. Viewers in countries where they did not air would, eventually, find ways to access them. The historical record of what the show had actually been would eventually be the version that mattered. By the time Mr. Greg aired in the United States, Steven Universe had become, in the international animation industry trade press, a kind of test case. It was the show that other networks were watching to see what happened. It was the show whose creator was making specific public statements about her creative priorities. It was the show whose international distributor was, episode by episode, making decisions about which episodes to air and which to skip. The trajectory the show was on was not subtle. The episodes were getting more direct about the romantic content, not less. The international restrictions were getting tighter, not looser. The conflict between the show's creative direction and the markets that would not air it was visible to anyone watching the broadcast schedule month by month. Mr. Greg was not the last episode in this pattern. By the end of 2016, the Russian feed would have skipped 4 episodes total in the span of less than a year. The 4th one would happen in September. It would involve a character almost everyone watching the show had assumed could not, structurally, have her own romantic subplot. The 6th of the 10 happened on September 8th, 2016, less than 2 months after Mr. Greg, and it caught some viewers off guard because the episode in question seemed, at first glance, to be a quiet character episode rather than a romantic one. Last One Out of Beach City is the 6th episode of the 4th season, originally aired on Cartoon Network on the evening of September 8th, 2016. It is the episode that, in retrospect, made it clear that the Russian distributor was not just banning episodes whose romantic content was central to the plot. It was banning episodes whose romantic content was even peripheral. If you had been watching the show casually up to this point, you might have assumed that the previous skips had been about a small number of high romance episodes. Last One Out of Beach City was the moment that assumption stopped being defensible. The premise of the episode is, on its surface, a comedy. Pearl, who has spent the previous several seasons positioned as the most rigid and uptight of the Crystal Gems, decides she wants to attend a rock concert. Amethyst, who was supposed to attend with Greg, has been left without a partner because Greg has a card game with Barb and Vidalia. Pearl offers to take Amethyst and Steven to the concert instead. The episode follows the 3 of them on the way to the venue, into the venue, through the concert, and back to Beach City afterward. The framing is light. Pearl, who almost never does anything spontaneous, makes a series of small attempts to be cool. She buys a juice, she tries on a leather jacket, she listens to the music, she tries to lean against a wall in a way that someone in a music video might lean against a wall. What changes the episode, structurally, is a single character who appears for less than 3 minutes of screen time. While Pearl, Amethyst, and Steven are at the donut shop on the way to the venue, a woman walks in. The episode does not name her. The credits, when they roll, list her only as Mystery Girl. She has pink hair, a leather jacket, a motorcycle helmet on her arm, and a bored expression. She orders a coffee. Pearl, watching her, becomes visibly transfixed. The scene is played for comedy. Amethyst, watching Pearl watch the woman, registers immediately what is happening. Steven, watching both of them, takes another beat to catch up. The Mystery Girl finishes ordering her coffee, glances at Pearl, and leaves. The rest of the episode is structured around Pearl trying to find this woman again. They see her at the concert. Pearl tries to introduce herself. The Mystery Girl gives Pearl her phone number on a piece of paper. Pearl, who has not at any point in the previous 3.5 seasons been shown to have anything that could be called a casual romantic interest in anyone, is now holding a piece of paper with a stranger's phone number on it. The episode ends with Pearl, Amethyst, and Steven driving back to Beach City in Greg's car, having a quiet conversation about what just happened. Pearl is, by the closing scene, more relaxed than she has been at any point in the season. She has met someone she finds interesting. She is going to call her. The Russian distributor reviewed Last One out of Beach City and chose not to air it. This was the 4th episode in less than 10 months to be skipped from the Russian Cartoon Network broadcast. The previous 3 skips had all involved Ruby and Sapphire, or Pearl and Rose, or in some way the show's established romantic relationships between named female characters. Last One out of Beach City was different. The episode does not depict a kiss, it does not depict a fusion, it does not depict a song about Pearl's love for another woman, it depicts Pearl meeting a stranger at a donut shop and being interested in her. The episode is, in romantic terms, the least explicit of the 4 episodes that had been skipped in Russia to that point. The fact that it was still skipped told viewers something specific about the criteria being applied. The Russian distributor was not banning episodes for explicit romantic content. The distributor was banning episodes for any romantic content between characters of the same coded sex, including non-explicit interest, including non-physical attraction, including a flirtation that does not, within the episode itself, actually go anywhere. The Bulgarian feed, again sharing the EMEA Russian master, also skipped the episode. The total number of episodes that had been skipped on the joint feed by this point was 4. A viewer in Russia or Bulgaria who had been following the show since the beginning had now missed The Answer, Hit the Diamond, Mr. Greg, and Last One out of Beach City. Those 4 episodes contain between them a substantial portion of the character development for Garnet, Pearl, and the show's broader treatment of its romantic themes. Viewers in those countries who were trying to follow the show's continuity by the fall of 2016 were watching a version of the show that had developed a series of unexplained gaps. Characters would behave in ways that were referencing things that the viewers had not seen. Songs would be referred to that the viewers had not heard. A piece of paper with a phone number would, in subsequent episodes, become a thing characters mentioned in passing. The viewers who had missed Last One out of Beach City would not know what the piece of paper was. The episode is also worth noting for what it represented in the show's broader narrative arc. Pearl, in the original conception of the show, had been written as a character whose entire emotional life was bound up in her past with Rose Quartz. The first 3 seasons had spent considerable time exploring how Pearl was processing Rose's death, Rose's choice to have a child with Greg, and Pearl's own ability to move forward. Last One out of Beach City was the first episode where Pearl was depicted even briefly as being interested in someone other than Rose. Within the show's broader plot, this is a significant character beat. It is the first crack in what had been, for several seasons, an emotional impasse. Pearl was capable of being attracted to someone else. Pearl was capable of moving on. The fact that the someone else was a pink-haired stranger at a donut shop, rather than another central character in the show, made the beat feel earned. Pearl was not, in this episode, finding her next great love. She was simply discovering that she could still notice someone. The Russian decision to skip the episode removed that beat from the version of the show that aired on the Russian feed. Pearl, in the Russian broadcast of the show, would continue to be a character whose emotional arc was defined by her relationship to Rose Quartz. The hint of forward movement that Last One Out of Beach City offered would not be available to Russian viewers. The character, as Russian viewers experienced her, would remain frozen in the same emotional posture that had defined her in the earlier seasons. Whether this was a meaningful loss for any individual viewer is a question that depends on how invested any individual viewer was in Pearl as a character. For viewers who cared about Pearl's arc, the loss was non-trivial. For viewers who watched the show as a series of self-contained adventure episodes, the loss may have been invisible. The Russian distributor, in skipping the episode, was not making a statement about character development. It was applying a content rule. The character development was collateral. Last One Out of Beach City also became the moment that international viewers who were tracking the censorship pattern started to ask a different kind of question. The previous 4 bans had been comprehensible on their own internal logic as applications of the Russian gay propaganda law to specific romantic content. The pattern was consistent. The pattern was clear. What viewers started asking after Last One Out of Beach City was where the pattern would end. If a brief flirtation between Pearl and a stranger at a donut shop was sufficient to trigger a ban, what would happen when the show eventually got to its more substantial romantic milestones? Rebecca Sugar had, in multiple interviews by this point, indicated that the show was building toward a wedding episode. The wedding had been part of the show's planning since the production of Jailbreak in 2014. The wedding would, when it eventually aired in July of 2018, be the first same-sex wedding depicted in a Western children's animated television series. If a brief flirtation between Pearl and Mystery Girl had been enough to skip Last One Out of Beach City, the wedding episode was going to be, in the international markets, a substantial problem. By the time Last One Out of Beach City finished its broadcast cycle in September 2016, the international censorship of Steven Universe was a story that mainstream animation press was covering on a near-monthly basis. The Comic Book Resources article in November 2017 that mapped out the pattern across multiple markets was, by that point, simply consolidating what fans had been tracking for over a year. The cumulative list of countries that were applying some form of restriction to the show was longer than the list of countries that were not. The United Kingdom had its EMEA master edits, Sweden had its dub modifications, Russia and Bulgaria had skipped 4 episodes. The MENA feed was, by this point, already on the verge of removing the show entirely. The Kenyan ban was 8 months away. The wedding episode was 22 months away. The trajectory of the next 2 years was, to anyone paying attention, predictable. What was unpredictable was just how comprehensive the restrictions would eventually become. If you were following the show closely at the time, you could already see the shape of what was coming. Even if you could not yet have predicted its scale, the next event in the pattern would happen in less than a month, and it would not be an edit to a single episode. It would be the disappearance of the entire show from an entire region. The 7th of the 10 happened in October 2016, and it was not an edit. It was a disappearance. Beginning in the first week of October, the Cartoon Network feed serving the Middle East and North Africa, the dedicated Cartoon Network Arabic feed, and the Cartoon Network Turkey feed all simultaneously stopped airing Steven Universe. The episodes that had been on the schedule were removed. The show was taken off the programming grid. The websites for those regional Cartoon Network operations were updated to remove the show from their listed lineups. The social media accounts for those regional operations stopped posting about the show. The YouTube channel stopped uploading clips. The mobile apps stopped offering episodes. Within a matter of weeks, in the territories served by these 3 feeds, Steven Universe had been removed not just from the broadcast schedule, but from the entire visible infrastructure that Cartoon Network used to promote and distribute its programming. The show, as far as those territories were concerned, no longer existed. The disappearance was never publicly explained by Cartoon Network or by Turner Broadcasting, which at the time controlled the regional feeds. There was no press release. There was no announcement on the relevant Cartoon Network social channels saying that the show had been removed. There was no acknowledgement in subsequent corporate communications that the show had ever aired on those feeds in the first place. Viewers in the affected countries who tried to find new episodes of the show on the channel where the rest of the season was airing internationally simply did not find them. The episodes had been there. Now they were not. The replacement programming for the time slots that Steven Universe had previously occupied was, in many cases, the newly premiered reboot of the Ben 10 franchise, which Cartoon Network had been preparing to launch across multiple international territories at the same time. The timing of the removal is part of the story. The Ben 10 reboot, which had been in development for over a year at Cartoon Network Studios, premiered globally in October 2016, across multiple Turner feeds. The slot that Steven Universe had been occupying on the MENA, Arabic, and Turkey feeds was, in many cases, the slot that the new Ben 10 episodes were given. The operational framing offered by Cartoon Network, in the limited internal communications that have since been documented by viewers and former employees who have spoken about the period, was that the schedule changes were routine programming adjustments timed to a major new series launch. The fact that the schedule changes happened to remove one specific show in the same week on 3 of the company's content-restricted regional feeds was treated by the network as coincidence. Almost no one watching the show in the affected territories accepted that framing. The pattern was too clean. The removed show was a show that had, over the previous year, been the subject of increasing public attention for its LGBT content. The replaced show was the show that, in the same territories, would generally have been considered the safest possible programming for a Cartoon Network feed. Ben 10 is, in content terms, an action show about a teenage boy with a watch that lets him transform into different aliens. It has no significant LGBT content, it has no romantic subplots between same-sex characters, it has no scenes that would, under any of the existing regional restrictions, require any edits at all. The choice to move Ben 10 into the time slot that Steven Universe had occupied was, in operational terms, a choice that solved several distribution problems at once. The new show needed a slot. The old show had been increasingly difficult to schedule. The two facts could be reconciled by removing the old show and adding the new one. What this meant for viewers in the affected countries was that the show they had been watching for over 2 years was, in a single programming grid update, gone. There was no path forward. There was no episode that would be airing next week. There was no announcement that the show would return after a hiatus. The show was simply not on the channel anymore. Viewers who wanted to keep watching had to find other routes. In some markets, the show remained available through Netflix MENA, which had a separate licensing arrangement that did not depend on the Cartoon Network regional feeds. In other markets, the show was not available through any legal streaming service after the Cartoon Network removal, which meant that the only way to keep watching was through unofficial uploads or imported physical media. The audience of legitimate paying viewers of Steven Universe in the affected countries was reduced almost overnight to whatever subset of those viewers had access to streaming services that retained the show. Everyone else either stopped watching, found a way around the regional restrictions, or, in a small but documented subset of cases, started learning English in order to watch the original American versions through routes that did not depend on regional licensing. The Turkish removal followed a similar pattern with one additional context that is worth noting. Cartoon Network Turkey had, throughout 2014 and 2015, used a localized Turkish language version of the show that had been dubbed by a Turkish voice cast and adapted for the local content rating system. The Turkish dub was, by the standards applied to other international dubs at the time, relatively faithful to the original. Most of the romantic content had been left intact. The Turkish language Strong Within You was, in particular, considered by Turkish fans of the show to be a successful adaptation. The removal in October 2016 made all of this irrelevant. The Turkish dub was no longer accessible through legal channels. The Turkish voice cast work was, for practical purposes, no longer in circulation. The show that Turkish fans had been watching, in their own language with their own cultural translations of the source material, simply stopped being broadcast and stopped being available through the official channels that had distributed it. The reasoning that has since been pieced together by fans and journalists covering the regional disappearance has settled, in most accounts, on a combination of factors. The Turner EMEA Middle East and Africa Turkey division was, by 2016, under operational pressure to standardize its content across multiple territories. The cost of maintaining separate edit masters, separate localized dubs, and separate regional rights for individual shows had been rising for several years. The launch of the Ben 10 reboot offered an opportunity to consolidate programming around a smaller number of titles that were easier to distribute across all of the territories the division served. Steven Universe was, by this point, a title that required custom handling in every market the division operated in. The MENA feed had its own cuts. The Turkish feed had its own dub. The Arabic feed had its own additional edits applied on top of the EMEA master. Each new episode required separate review for each feed. Each season required new contracts. The accumulated operational cost of distributing the show across those territories was, by the fall of 2016, larger than the operational cost of distributing most other Cartoon Network titles. What this meant in practical terms was that the decision to remove the show was a decision that the division could explain to itself as a cost reduction measure rather than as a content decision. The conversation in the operational framing was not about whether the show's romantic content was acceptable. It was about whether the resources required to handle the show across the territories were worth the audience numbers the show was generating in those territories. The numbers, by the company's internal analysis, were not particularly strong. Steven Universe had a passionate fan base in the MENA region, but the fan base was small. The show was not a top-rated children's program in any of the affected countries. The new Ben 10 reboot was, in commercial projections, expected to outperform Steven Universe in those markets even before any consideration of content. The decision to swap one show for the other was, from the division's perspective, both a content simplification and a commercial improvement. The two things lined up. This framing has been disputed by fans and by some of the writers who have covered the international history of the show. The argument against it is that the timing of the swap, the targeting of 3 specific content-restricted feeds rather than a broader set of feeds, and the lack of any public acknowledgement of the change all suggest that the operational framing was retrofitted onto a decision that was actually about content. The show was removed from the 3 feeds that had the most documented difficulty handling its content. It was not removed from feeds that had handled its content without significant issue. The pattern, viewed from the outside, looks less like a cost reduction and more like a quiet content decision dressed in operational language. Whether the operational framing or the content framing is more accurate is something that would be possible to determine only with access to internal documents that Turner has not made public. What can be observed from the outside is the result. The show in 3 territories stopped airing in October 2016 and did not return. The disappearance also had a documented effect on the show's international fan base in those territories. Fans who had been actively engaged with the show through legitimate channels were, in many cases, forced into either disengagement or unofficial access. Some chose disengagement. Some chose unofficial access. Some, particularly in the Turkish fan base, organized formal complaints to Cartoon Network through public channels. The complaints were generally not acknowledged. The show did not return. The replacement programming continued. Over the following year, the situation became, for most affected viewers, the new baseline. The show that had been part of the regional schedule for 2.5 years was no longer there and would not be there again. In retrospect, the October 2016 disappearance is the moment that the international censorship of Steven Universe stopped being about specific episodes and started being about the show as a whole. The previous cuts had been individual editorial decisions. The Russian and Bulgarian skips had been individual episode bans. The MENA, Arabic, and Turkey removals were comprehensive. The show, in those territories, no longer existed on Cartoon Network's regional infrastructure. There was no specific scene to point to. There was no specific edit to compare. There was no specific episode that had been singled out. The entire show was gone, and the reasons were not being publicly discussed. The disappearance set the precedent that would, 8 months later, be repeated on a different continent, under different circumstances, and with explicit public acknowledgement. The next event in the pattern would not be a quiet operational removal. It would be a formal government announcement, in Kenya, by a censorship board whose chief executive would describe what he was doing in detail. The 8th of the 10 is in some ways the strangest of the set, because it is not an edit to a specific episode, and it is not an outright ban. It is a translation choice applied consistently across the entire run of the show in a single country. That fundamentally changed what the show was about for the viewers who watched it through that translation. The country was Russia. The translation choice was the decision by the team responsible for the Russian language dub of Steven Universe to render the character Ruby as a male character. Across every episode, in every season, in every line of dialogue that referenced Ruby's pronouns or her relationship to Sapphire, the Russian dub treated Ruby as a man. To understand the scale of what this meant, you have to think about what Ruby is to the show. Ruby is one half of the fusion that forms Garnet. She is, in the show's own internal mythology, the embodiment of devotion, of impulse, of the willingness to throw oneself in front of a sword for another person. Her relationship with Sapphire is the foundational romantic relationship of the entire series. Their love is the reason Garnet exists. Their love is the reason for the show's most cited song. Their love is what the wedding episode, when it eventually airs in 2018, will be about. Ruby's identity as a female-coded character and her romantic relationship with another female-coded character is not a detail of the show. It is the structural foundation of one of the show's 2 central relationships, alongside the relationship between Steven's father Greg and his mother Rose Quartz. The Russian dub did not, by all available accounts, set out to make a political statement about the character. The translation choice was, in the operational framing offered by the Russian distributor, a way of making the show legally distributable in Russia under the gay propaganda law. If Ruby was a male character, then the romantic relationship between Ruby and Sapphire was a heterosexual relationship. If the romantic relationship between Ruby and Sapphire was heterosexual, then the episodes that depicted that relationship were no longer covered by the law's restrictions. The translation choice was, in this framing, a creative workaround that allowed the rest of the show to air in Russia. The cost of the workaround was that the central character of one of the show's most important relationships was, in the Russian version, no longer the character the show had been writing. The choice did not, in practice, solve the legal problem completely. The episodes that had been skipped in Russia continued to be skipped, even after the dub had been in place for over a year. The Answer was not aired with a regendered Ruby. Hit the Diamond was not aired with a regendered Ruby. Mr. Gred was not aired with a regendered Ruby. The dub modification in those cases was not considered sufficient to allow the episodes to be distributed. What the dub did do was allow the rest of the show, the episodes in which Ruby appeared without a romantic plot at the center of the episode, to continue airing on the Russian feed. Ruby could appear in fight scenes, in comedic moments, in background appearances. The romantic content was the part that the dub could not paper over. The skipped episodes were the episodes where the romantic content was the structural point. What this created for Russian viewers was a viewing experience with two simultaneous incoherences. The first incoherence was the gap in the broadcast itself. 4 episodes were missing. The viewer could not follow the show's continuity if the viewer did not have access to those 4 episodes. The second incoherence was internal to the episodes that did air. Ruby in the Russian dub was a man. Sapphire in the Russian dub was a woman. The character's romantic relationship, in the episodes where it was visible without being structurally central, was depicted in the Russian dub as a relationship between a male character and a female character. The visual animation, however, was unchanged. The viewer was seeing a female presenting character with a male voice. The viewer was being told, through the dialogue, that this character was male, while the visual evidence on the screen suggested otherwise. The dissonance was not subtle. Russian fans of the show were aware of it. The fan community in Russia developed, over the course of the show's run, an extensive set of unofficial annotations and corrections that fans shared with one another to make sense of what the official broadcast was showing them. The gender swap of Ruby is documented across multiple sources, including English language outlets that covered the international censorship of the show. The Comic Book Resources article that mapped the international cuts in November 2017 mentioned the Russian dub specifically. Trade publications covering animation in 2017 and 2018 mentioned it. Russian fans themselves, when interviewed by English language press, have spoken about the experience of watching the show in their native language and being told something that conflicted with the visual evidence. The pattern was strange enough that it became, in the international press coverage of the show, one of the most cited examples of what international content adaptation can look like when the legal restrictions of the market are at odds with the source material. There was a smaller version of the same problem in several other Eastern European markets that shared the Turner EMEA Russia and Southeast Europe master. The Russian language dub was the most directly affected because the translation choice had been made at the language level. The other languages in the territory, including Bulgarian, Romanian, Hungarian, and Czech, were each handled by their own translation teams, and each made different choices about how to handle the character. The Bulgarian dub kept Ruby's pronouns female and accepted that the episodes featuring her romantic content would not air. The Hungarian dub similarly kept the pronouns female. The Czech dub, which broadcast to both Czechia and Slovakia, retained the original female pronouns and did not significantly soften the romantic content in the episodes that aired. The Russian choice was, in this respect, an outlier even within its own broadcast region. Other Eastern European countries, faced with the same source material and similar but not identical legal frameworks, made different choices. Russia's choice was to change the character. The choice has significant implications for the wedding episode that would eventually air in 2018. The wedding in the show's English version is the wedding of 2 characters who have been depicted across the entire run of the show as being in a same-sex relationship. In the Russian version, the wedding would have been, if it had aired, the wedding of 2 characters who had been depicted across the Russian language run of the show as being in an opposite-sex relationship. The Russian dub's modification of Ruby's gender would have, in this scenario, allowed the wedding to air as a conventional heterosexual marriage ceremony. Whether the Russian distributor would have aired the wedding under those conditions is a question that, as you would expect, has never been definitively answered, because the wedding episode never aired in Russia at all. The decision was made ahead of the episode's international broadcast to skip it entirely. The Russian dub's workaround had a limit. The wedding episode was past that limit. The Russian dub of Steven Universe is, in the broader history of international animation localization, an unusual case. Translations of children's animation routinely involve adaptations of cultural references, idioms, jokes, and song lyrics. Translations occasionally involve adjustments to character names, particularly when a character's name in the source language has connotations that would not translate. What translations almost never involve in mainstream commercial children's animation is a wholesale modification of a character's gender. The Ruby modification in the Russian dub is one of the few documented cases in the modern era of an international localization team making a change of this scope to accommodate domestic content law. It is cited in academic discussions of international animation distribution. It is cited in industry analyses of how the Russian gay propaganda law has affected the import of foreign children's media. It is cited in the broader cultural conversation about what happens to art when it crosses legal jurisdictions whose restrictions conflict with the art's structure. For the Russian viewer who watched the show in real time as it aired, the dub created a specific kind of relationship with the source material that English language viewers do not have. The Russian viewer was, in effect, watching a different show. The show they were watching had the same animation, the same plot structure, the same character designs, the same songs in the same musical positions. The show they were watching also had a different set of characters in one of its central relationships, because the central relationship had been regendered. The Russian viewer who became deeply invested in the show, who became aware of the international fan community, and who eventually accessed the original English version through unofficial channels, would have had an experience that few viewers in other countries had. They would have been able to compare directly the official version of the show that they had been watching with the original version of the show that the rest of the world had been watching. The two versions would have had different characters in one of the most important relationships of the entire series. The realization of this difference, for Russian viewers who eventually had it, has been documented in a number of personal essays, interviews, and Russian language fan forum posts over the years. The realization is often described in terms that suggest a particular kind of betrayal. The viewer had loved the show had not, in some sense, been telling them the truth. By the time the wedding episode aired in the United States in July 2018, the Russian situation was understood both inside and outside Russia as a special case. The dub had been in place for years. The skipped episodes had accumulated, the fan base had built its own parallel infrastructure for accessing the original version of the show, the legal restrictions had not been relaxed. The pattern, in Russia specifically, was stable. What was about to change, in the territories that had not yet experienced their own version of the Russian pattern, was that the formal mechanism for restricting the show was about to escalate from regional editorial decisions and national broadcast skips to something more public. The next event in the pattern would not happen quietly. It would be announced in a press conference by a government official with a specific list of programs and a specific stated reason. If you were a Steven Universe viewer in that country at the time, you would learn about the new restriction not from the show itself, but from the morning news. It would happen in Kenya in June of 2017. The 9th of the 10 happened in mid-June of 2017 in Nairobi, and it was the first time a national government had used the word ban in connection with Steven Universe. The body that issued the ban was the Kenya Film Classification Board, a state regulatory body responsible for rating and classifying film and television content for distribution in Kenya. The chief executive officer of the KFCB at the time was Ezekiel Mutua, who had been in the position since 2015 and had become, in the years before the Steven Universe ban, one of the most publicly visible figures in Kenyan media regulation. The ban was issued on June 14, 2017, in a formal statement that was distributed to Kenyan press, to international wire services, and to the channels carrying the affected programs. The statement named 6 cartoons. Steven Universe was the 4th name on the list. If you were a parent in Nairobi that morning trying to figure out what your child could and could not watch, you found out at the same moment the rest of the country did. If you have been following the previous episodes, you can see immediately why the Kenya ban marked a different kind of event. The previous removals had been done quietly. The MENA, Arabic, and Turkey disappearances in October 2016 had happened without public acknowledgement. The Russian and Bulgarian episode skips had happened without statements. The UK and Scandinavian dub edits had happened with corporate explanations that framed them as routine programming decisions. The Kenya ban was none of these things. It was announced publicly, it was justified publicly. It was published in writing, it was discussed by the chief executive of the regulatory body on national broadcast media within days of its issuance. The transparency of the Kenya ban made it, in a particular respect, the easiest to discuss internationally. There was a paper trail, there were named officials, there were quoted statements. The previous patterns of international restriction had often had to be reconstructed by fans from indirect evidence. The Kenya ban announced itself. The full list of programs that the KFCB banned on June 14, 2017 included The Loud House, which had been airing on Nickelodeon, The Legend of Korra, which had concluded its run on Nickelodeon in 2014, and Hey Arnold, which had concluded its original run on Nickelodeon in 2004. From Cartoon Network, the list included Clarence, Adventure Time, and Steven Universe. In some accounts of the ban that appeared in the days that followed, Disney's Star vs. the Forces of Evil and Gravity Falls were also included, although the formal published list of 6 did not name those two. The shared characteristic among the named programs was that all of them in the KFCB's stated assessment contained content that the board described as normalizing, glamorizing, or glorifying homosexual behavior. The KFCB's statement, signed by Mutua, was reproduced widely in international press in the days after the ban. The statement framed the ban as a response to complaints received by the board from members of the Kenyan public over the preceding several weeks. The statement asserted that the board had conducted what it described as thorough investigations and had determined that the named programs were currently being aired on the DSTV and GeoTV pay television platforms, both of which were operated by the South African media company MultiChoice. The statement directed MultiChoice to cease airing the programs immediately and indicated that the board had instructed its legal counsel to prepare action against MultiChoice in the event of non-compliance. The legal basis for the ban, as articulated in the statement and in Mutua's subsequent public comments, rested on Kenyan domestic law. Homosexuality in Kenya has been criminalized since the colonial period, under penal code provisions inherited from British rule that have been retained and updated by post-independence governments. The provisions remain in force as of the current Kenyan legal framework. The KFCB's content classification guidelines incorporate the broader Kenyan legal context, and the board has, throughout its history, used those guidelines to restrict content depicting same-sex relationships. The statement asserted that the programs were targeting what it described as vulnerable children with subtle messages deliberately designed to corrupt their moral judgment regarding the institution of family. The phrase about the institution of family appeared multiple times in Mutua's public statements about the ban over the following weeks. The MultiChoice response was compliance. The company, which operated the DSTV satellite pay television service across more than 50 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, agreed to pull the named programs from its lineup. The agreement was not limited to Kenya. MultiChoice's DSTV service was distributed across the entire region, and the company's standard practice was to use a single content master across all of its territories. The decision to remove the named programs from the DSTV lineup in Kenya, in operational practice, removed them from the DSTV lineup across the entire sub-Saharan African distribution. The Kenya ban, in this respect, had effects far beyond Kenya. Viewers in dozens of African countries who watched the named programs through DSTV lost access to them as a direct consequence of the Kenyan regulatory action. The DSTV subscriber base was, at the time the ban took effect, approximately 10.4 million subscribers across the region. The number of individuals who lost access to the programs as a result of the Kenya ban was substantially larger than the population of Kenya itself. Mutua's public role in the ban became, in the months that followed, the focal point of much of the international coverage. He gave a series of interviews to Kenyan and international press in which he elaborated on his views about the programs, about what he described as the systematic exposure of Kenyan children to LGBT content through imported animation, and about his broader regulatory philosophy regarding film and television. His statements were frequently quoted in trade publications covering international animation distribution. The Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, an American nonprofit that monitors international censorship of comics and related media, published an article on June 29, 2017 that summarized the Kenya ban and quoted directly from the KFCB statement. The article noted that some of the named programs, including The Legend of Korra, had concluded their original broadcast runs years before the ban was issued and were no longer airing in any market at the time. The ban applied to reruns, to streaming distribution, and to any future reissues. NPR ran a feature in February 2017, 4 months before the formal cartoon ban, that profiled Mutua as the head of Kenya's film board and discussed his expanding portfolio of public censorship actions. The feature noted that Mutua had, in the preceding year, used his position to weigh in on issues including online music video distribution, lesbian speed dating events, and the editorial choices made by Kenyan television stations. The feature included extensive comments from Mutua about his understanding of his role and from Kenyan LGBT activists about the effects of his public actions on their work. The activists interviewed described Mutua's expanding portfolio of regulatory actions as having had a chilling effect on artistic and journalistic work in Kenya, particularly any work that engaged with LGBT themes or with related issues like gender identity and sexual orientation. The June 2017 cartoon ban was, in this context, the continuation of an existing pattern rather than a new departure. The reasons that the KFCB gave for banning the specific cartoons it banned have been documented in detail by reporters covering the announcement. In communications between the KFCB and MultiChoice, Mutua reportedly cited specific scenes in specific episodes as evidence for the ban. For Steven Universe, the cited material included the romantic content between Ruby and Sapphire, the Pearl Rose backstory, and a vacation episode involving Pearl, Greg, and Steven that the board characterized as an implied romantic vacation between same-sex characters. The reasoning struck most international observers as superficial. The Pearl, Greg, Steven vacation episode in question, Mr. Greg, is not depicted as a romantic vacation between Pearl and Greg. The episode is as discussed in the earlier section about Mr. Greg, the resolution of years of emotional tension between two characters who had both loved the same woman. The framing offered by the KFCB suggested that the board's review of the episode had focused on the surface premise of the trip rather than on the actual content of the episode. The framing was, in international animation industry coverage of the ban, taken as evidence that the KFCB had not done the kind of detailed review of the programs that its statement suggested it had done. What is sometimes lost in the international coverage of the ban is what it meant for individual viewers in Kenya and the broader region. By 2017, Steven Universe had developed a small but engaged fan base in several African countries, particularly among teenage and young adult viewers who had been watching the show through DSTV since its initial regional broadcast. The fan base included LGBT viewers for whom the show had been one of the few mainstream pieces of animated entertainment available in their region that depicted same-sex relationships in a positive light. The removal of the show from DSTV in the wake of the Kenya ban was experienced by those viewers as a specific kind of loss. They lost access to a piece of media that had, in some cases, been one of the first places they had encountered representation of their own identities on screen. The Kenyan LGBT community's response to the ban was complicated. The community had limited legal protections under Kenyan law and limited public platforms for protest. Public organizing against the ban was politically risky for the individuals involved. The response that emerged was largely through online channels, through international press contacts, and through informal networks of viewers who continued to access the banned programs through unofficial means after the official channels stopped carrying them. The ban, in practical terms, did not stop Kenyan viewers who wanted to keep watching the show from finding ways to do so. What it did do was remove the show from the most accessible and most affordable distribution channel available to them, which was the DSTV subscription that many households already had for other programming. The viewers who could afford alternative subscription services or who had the technical knowledge to access unofficial sources continued to watch. The viewers who did not have those resources lost the show. The Kenya ban also had effects on the show's distribution that extended beyond the immediate sub-Saharan African market. International press coverage of the ban became part of the broader story of the show's international censorship history. The Kenya statement was, in subsequent industry discussions of the show, frequently cited as the clearest articulation of why a foreign government would object to the show. The reasoning was direct. The reasoning was published. The reasoning could be cited in any subsequent conversation about international content distribution and LGBT representation in children's animation. For the show's creators in the United States, the Kenya ban became one of the data points they would reference in their own public statements about the trade-offs involved in writing the show they had chosen to write. Rebecca Sugar, in subsequent interviews, would mention the ban as evidence of the kinds of resistance the show faced internationally. The ban became, in this respect, part of the show's public record. Ezekiel Mutua remained in his position as KFCB Chief Executive Officer until 2021, when he left the role in a Kenyan government reshuffling. His successor at the KFCB has not, as of the most recent public information, formally reversed the 2017 cartoon ban. The named programs remain officially restricted from broadcast on Kenyan platforms. The practical effect of the ban, 8 years after it was issued, is that the programs are not available through legal Kenyan distribution channels. Although they remain available through international streaming services that some Kenyan viewers can access, the ban itself has remained on the books. The cultural and regulatory context that produced the ban has not significantly shifted. The Kenyan legal framework regarding homosexuality has not changed since 2017. The Kenyan fan community for Steven Universe has, in the intervening years, organized largely through international online platforms and through informal networks that do not depend on local distribution. The Kenya ban is, in the chronology of the international censorship of Steven Universe, the moment that the pattern crossed a threshold that the previous events had not crossed. The previous events had been operational. They had been editorial. They had been quiet. The Kenya ban was political, it was public, it was formal, it involved a named government official, a published statement, a specific legal framework, and a documented enforcement mechanism. After Kenya, the conversation about Steven Universe's international distribution would not be the same. The next event in the pattern would happen a year and 22 days later, on July 6th, 2018, and it would involve the broadcast of the single episode that the show's creators had been working toward since the second year of production. The Kenya ban set the stage for what the international response to that episode would be. The episode would air in the United States. It would air in many international markets. It would not air in any meaningful form in the countries that had been restricting the show throughout the preceding 3.5 years. The 10th of the 10 happened on July 6th, 2018, and it was the moment the show's creator had been building toward since the production of the first season finale in 2014. The episode was reunited, the 23rd and 24th episodes of the 5th season broadcast together as a single 22-minute special on Cartoon Network in the United States. It was the 7th and final episode of a week-long programming event the network was calling Steven Bomb, with episodes airing daily from July 2nd through July 6th. Reunited featured the wedding of Ruby and Sapphire, and it was at the time it aired the first depiction of a same-sex wedding in any Western mainstream children's animated television series. It was also the most internationally restricted single episode of Steven Universe ever produced. If you watch it today, what you are seeing is the episode in the form its creators intended. What audiences in several other countries saw, if they saw anything at all, was something else. To understand what the wedding episode was inside the show, you have to understand what the show had been building. The story of Ruby and Sapphire had been the show's central love story since The Answer aired in January 2016. Their previous flashback episodes had told the story of how they met, how they first fused, how they decided to remain together as Garnet, and how their relationship had developed across thousands of years of in-universe time. The episode immediately before Reunited in the Steven Bomb week, The Question, had featured Ruby's marriage proposal to Sapphire. The proposal scene was, in its own right, the first depiction of a same-sex marriage proposal in mainstream Western children's animation, when it aired on July 4th, 2018. The proposal and the wedding had been planned together. The wedding had been planned since before the proposal had been written. Rebecca Sugar, in interviews published in the months around the wedding episode, described the production history of the wedding in detail. The original plan to give Ruby and Sapphire a wedding had been developed during the production of Jailbreak, the first season finale in 2014. At the time the original plan was developed, same-sex marriage had not yet been legalized at the federal level in the United States. The Obergefell v. Hodges Supreme Court decision that legalized same-sex marriage nationally would not be issued until June 2015, a year after Jailbreak entered production. Sugar's intent to depict a same-sex wedding in the show predated the legal status of same-sex marriage in her own country. The intent to depict it was, from the beginning, an intent to put on screen a kind of relationship that the show's writers believed deserved to be depicted regardless of the contemporary legal context. The production of Reunited, 4 years after the original plan was developed, was the realization of that intent. What you should know about the production history of the episode is that by Sugar's later public account, the wedding had been the subject of significant internal pushback from Cartoon Network executives during the years between the original plan and the eventual broadcast. The executives had, in Sugar's account, been concerned about the international distribution implications of the episode. They had been concerned about advertiser response. They had been concerned about the potential pressure on other Cartoon Network programs to include similar content. Sugar's position in those internal conversations was that the wedding was integral to the narrative the show had been telling. The wedding was not a special episode addition. The wedding was the structural payoff of years of character development. To remove it from the show would, in her framing, be to remove the conclusion the show had been writing toward. After multiple rounds of internal discussion, the wedding was approved. The episode entered production. Reunited aired on the date it had been scheduled to air, on July 6, 2018, as part of the Steven Bomb week the network had been promoting since the beginning of the summer. The American broadcast of Reunited was watched by a substantial audience and received extensive press coverage in the days that followed. Trade publications covered the wedding as a milestone in children's animation. General interest publications covered it as a milestone in LGBT representation in media. Industry analysts noted that the broadcast had taken place without any of the advertiser backlash that some had predicted. The episode received largely positive critical responses, with the wedding sequence specifically being highlighted in nearly every review. The American broadcast of Reunited was, in its domestic context, a successful and well-received television event. The international story was different. If you were watching the show through international Cartoon Network feeds in July 2018, your experience of Reunited depended entirely on which feed you were watching. In the United States, Canada, Australia in its uncensored form, and most Western European countries, the episode aired as written. In Poland, the episode was significantly cut, with the wedding ceremony itself trimmed in ways that left the episode structurally incoherent. In several Southeast Asian markets, including the Philippines, the episode was either heavily edited or skipped entirely. In Russia and Bulgaria, the episode was skipped, as expected based on the pattern that had been established with the previous 4 banned episodes. In the Middle East and North Africa, the show had been off the Cartoon Network feeds for nearly 2 years by the time Reunited aired, and the episode was not aired in those territories in any form. In Kenya and the broader sub-Saharan African region, the show had been banned for over a year by the time the episode aired. The wedding in those markets was something the rest of the world watched, while the local audience was not permitted to. The episode's specific content makes the international restrictions worth examining closely. The wedding ceremony itself, in the American version, takes place on the beach outside the Crystal Gems Temple. Stephen officiates. The attendees include the human residents of Beach City who have known the Gems throughout the show. Ruby and Sapphire arrive separately, walking down opposite ends of the beach toward an arch built for the ceremony. They exchange vows, they kiss, they are pronounced, they fuse in the kind of triumphant fusion sequence that the show had been using since Jailbreak, into Garnet, who completes the ceremony as a single fused individual. The wedding sequence is approximately 3 minutes long. It is followed immediately by an attack from Blue Diamond and Yellow Diamond, who arrive to avenge Pink Diamond's death and cut the wedding celebration short. The second half of Reunited is the resulting battle. The first half is the wedding. The Polish broadcast removed the kiss and a portion of the wedding vows. The remaining ceremony plays as a sequence in which Ruby and Sapphire arrive at the altar, perform an abbreviated ceremony, fuse into Garnet, and then are attacked by the diamonds. The structural meaning of the wedding is preserved in the Polish version, in the sense that you can tell the 2 characters got married. The specific content of the ceremony is significantly thinned. The kiss is gone. Several lines of dialogue between Ruby and Sapphire about what they are promising one another are gone. The Polish version of the wedding is recognizably a wedding. It is also a wedding that has been edited in a way that, if you watch the American version afterward, makes the editing visible by what is missing. The Southeast Asian situation was more variable. The Philippines, which used the Turner Asia Pacific Master, received a version of the episode with significant cuts. The Cartoon Network Asia broadcast, in some accounts, did not air the episode at all in the original broadcast cycle. The episode eventually became available in some Southeast Asian markets through streaming services that operated outside the regional Cartoon Network feeds, but the broadcast version was either heavily edited or absent. Indonesia, Malaysia, and several other markets in the region did not see the episode through standard broadcast channels. The Middle East and North Africa situation was the clearest. Steven Universe had been removed from the Cartoon Network MENA, Cartoon Network Arabic, and Cartoon Network Turkey feeds in October 2016. The show had not aired on those feeds for nearly 2 years by the time Reunited was broadcast in the United States. The wedding episode was for viewers in those territories who depended on those feeds simply unavailable. Viewers who had Netflix MENA subscriptions could access the episode through that service for some period of time after its original broadcast. Viewers who did not have alternative streaming subscriptions could not access the episode at all through legal channels. The audience for the wedding episode in the MENA region was, by available estimates, a small fraction of what it had been when the show was still actively airing on the Cartoon Network regional feeds. The audience for the wedding episode in the Kenyan and broader sub-Saharan African DSTV regions was effectively zero through legal channels, given the 2017 ban. Russia did not air the episode. The Russian distributor, which had been skipping romantic content episodes throughout the show's run, had no operational mechanism for airing a wedding episode. The Russian dub's modification of Ruby's gender, which had allowed parts of the show to air in modified form, was not sufficient to allow a wedding episode to air. The wedding, even with a regendered Ruby, would have involved a marriage ceremony, public vows, a kiss, and a fusion celebration. The episode could not be edited to remove the wedding while remaining recognizable as Reunited, because the wedding was the first half of the episode. The Russian decision was the same as it had been with the previous 4 banned episodes. The episode would not air. The viewer in Russia who had been following the show would, again, find a gap in the broadcast schedule where the episode should have been. The fan response in the affected territories was, by July 2018, substantially more organized than it had been in January 2016 when the We Need to Talk edit had first drawn international attention. The intervening 2.5 years had produced a substantial network of fans across multiple countries who had been documenting the international censorship of the show in detail. Fan-maintained wikis tracked every cut, every translation change, every banned episode, and every regional broadcast decision. By the time Reunited aired and was variously cut or banned across multiple markets, the documentation infrastructure was in place to map the international response within hours of the original broadcast. International fans of the show had been preparing for this episode for years. When it aired in their countries in modified form, or when it failed to air at all, the response was immediate, organized, and well documented. Cartoon Network, for its part, did not publicly comment on the international restrictions on Reunited in any detail. The position the company took, when pressed by trade publications, was the same position it had taken throughout the show's run. International distribution decisions were made by regional partners. The American broadcast was the version of the show the production team had made. Foreign markets adapted that version for local requirements. The company did not endorse the local adaptations. The company also did not, in any documented case, push to have specific adaptations reversed. The arrangement was, in operational terms, that the company would make the show in the United States and the international partners would make whatever distribution decisions their local context required. What this meant for the show as a whole was that the wedding, which had been the defining narrative payoff of years of character development, existed in 2 parallel versions across the international distribution. The American version was the complete version that the production team had written and animated. The international versions were, in varying degrees, edited, cut, or absent. A viewer who watched the show only through one of the restricted international feeds in 2018 would have a fundamentally different understanding of what the show had been about than a viewer who watched the show through the American broadcast. The 2 viewers would have seen the same animation, mostly. They would have heard the same songs, mostly. They would have followed the same plot, mostly. What they would not have seen, or would have seen only in a heavily modified form, was the relationship that the show had been about. The wedding was the moment that the divergence between the 2 versions became impossible to paper over. Before the wedding, the international cuts had been small enough that a casual viewer might not have noticed them. After the wedding, the cuts were no longer small. They were the central scene of the central episode of one of the show's 2 main romantic relationships. They could not be hidden. The international audiences in the affected countries knew what they were missing, because the rest of the world was watching what they could not see. Reunited is, in retrospect, the moment at which the international censorship history of Steven Universe became something that the show's creators could discuss publicly with a clear conscience. The wedding had been planned. The wedding had been written. The wedding had been animated. The wedding had been broadcast in the United States. The international response had been what the creators had expected it would be. The cuts had happened. The bans had happened. The fan documentation had recorded all of it. The show that the creators had been making was in its complete form the show that the creators had been making. The international versions were, in the framing the creators eventually settled on, evidence of the conditions the show had been operating under, not modifications of the show itself. The complete show existed. The complete show would continue to exist in whatever distribution channels were able to carry it. The audiences and markets where the complete show could not be aired would eventually find ways to access the complete show, because they almost always did. What Reunited demonstrated, beyond any individual viewer's experience of any individual broadcast, was that the international restrictions on Steven Universe had not, after 3.5 years of accumulating, succeeded in stopping the show from arriving at the place the show had been going. The wedding aired. The episode, the character development was complete. The international restrictions had restricted the international audience for the episode. They had not restricted the episode itself. The episode that the show's creators had been working towards since 2014 had been produced and broadcast as planned. What happened to it in other countries was a matter of record. What it was as a piece of finished work was also a matter of record. The 2 records did not match. The international record showed cuts and bans and absences. The domestic record showed the work as it had been made. Both records would continue to exist alongside each other for as long as the show remained in distribution. which, as of the most recent information about the show's streaming availability, is still the case nearly a decade after Reunited first aired. What the 10 stories together tell you, taken as a single record across 3.5 years and at least 3 continents, is something specific about what happens when a piece of children's animation is built around content that the international markets it depends on will not accept. The show was not interrupted. The show was not canceled because of the international pressure. The creators did not significantly change the trajectory the show was on. The show continued to be produced in the United States according to the same creative direction it had been following from the beginning. What changed was not the show. What changed was the version of the show that was permitted to exist in each of the markets the show was being distributed to. The pattern that emerges, if you look at the 10 events in chronological order, is that the international restrictions started small and grew. The first event was a single mistranslation of a song that was quickly corrected. The last event was a wedding episode that several countries either heavily edited or refused to air at all. Between those 2 points, the restrictions accumulated. They became more public. They became more formal. They were articulated in the language of corporate operational decisions, then in the language of regional broadcast standards, then in the language of national content law, and finally in the language of state regulatory action. Each step in the escalation produced a slightly different relationship between the show and the markets that carried it. By the end, the relationship was that the show existed in one form in the country where it was produced and in a series of progressively reduced forms in the countries that distributed it. The full version of the show, the version that the creators had made, was the version that the smallest number of international viewers actually saw. What you also see, looking at the same chronology, is that the show kept going. The episodes that were banned in one country were celebrated in another. The episodes that were edited were preserved in their full form somewhere. The fans who could not access the legal version found unofficial versions. The fans who could access the legal version often made themselves into informal archivists of what the international versions had removed. The documentation that was built up across multiple countries and multiple languages over the years that the show was airing is at this point comprehensive enough that any future researcher who wants to understand exactly what happened to which scene in which market on which date can find that information. The show, in this respect, became its own historical record. The story of what was done to it is also the story of how that doing was tracked. The decision the show's creator made at the beginning of all this, to keep writing the show the way the show was being written regardless of what international distribution would do with it, is the decision that produced all of the events that followed. If the show had been written differently, the cuts would not have been necessary. The bans would not have happened. The Russian dub would not have needed to regender a character. The Kenya Film Classification Board would not have had a reason to issue a public statement. The show that we are talking about would not exist in the form it exists in, and there would be nothing to discuss. The cost of writing the show the way the show was written, the choice the creators made was to pay that cost. The show that resulted from paying it is the show that aired in the United States across 5 seasons, 2 limited series, and a feature-length theatrical-style film. Whether the cost was worth paying is a question that depends on which audience you are asking. The American audience that received the complete show would, in most cases, say yes. The Russian audience that missed 4 episodes and watched a regendered version of the rest would, in many cases, also say yes, although their answer would carry a different weight. The Kenyan audience that lost access to the show entirely would, in many cases, also say yes. The fact that all 3 audiences with different levels of access to the same work would arrive at the same answer is in its own way the most direct evidence of what the show meant to the people who watched it. Return now to the moment that began all of this. On January 6, 2016, a viewer in the United Kingdom watched a flashback episode of a children's cartoon and noticed that 3 seconds of footage had been replaced with a reaction shot of someone watching from across the room. The viewer posted the comparison online. The petition that followed gathered 9,000 signatures. The network released a statement saying that the slightly edited version was more comfortable for local kids and their parents. The edit was never reversed. That single 3-second cut, the smallest possible piece of the pattern, was the first one that anyone outside the show's production noticed. Everything that followed across 2.5 years and 3 continents followed in some sense from the question that the cut produced. The question was whether a children's cartoon could depict a relationship between 2 women without that depiction being edited away. The answer, depending on which country you watch the show in, turned out to be different things. The story of those different answers is the story of what an animated television series can mean, when the meaning is what makes it difficult to distribute. The viewer in the United Kingdom who noticed the missing 3 seconds in January 2016 was, without knowing it at the time, watching the opening of a pattern that would take until July 2018 to fully complete. The 3 seconds were the beginning, the wedding was the end, everything in between was the show insisting on what it was. Thank you for staying. Sleep well. I will see you in the next one.